And that brings up our In Focus for the evening. India, number 5 economy in the world. And we have a special guest to talk about this with us this evening. Sanjeev Sania is with us. He's member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Committee. Good evening to you, Sanjeev Sania. Great to have you with us. Now, there are different sorts of reactions. People are elated. People are reflective as well. Some people are saying that we still have a long way to go. Which school of opinion are you following, and for which reason?
Well, I mean, it's certainly good news that we have become the 5th largest economy in the world in nominal dollar terms. Let me remind you a couple of things that in purchasing power parity terms, we have been the 3rd largest economy in the world for some time. So we have been, so this is, do remember, in nominal dollar terms.
Yes.
And also do remember that our per capita income is still some way to go. So there are two things you need to keep in balance. But nevertheless, this is good news in terms of the sheer size of our economy, and of course the fact that our economy is now, by some margin, the world's fastest growing major economy, and likely to remain in that position for some time. My own sense is that we will probably go up one notch at least in the next year or two.
Okay.
And then simply because Germany's economy in dollar terms has significantly declined, simply because the euro has declined. So that one we may be able to cross rather faster than maybe people estimate, not only because of our own growth, but because of Germany's own problems. But yes, do remember that China and the US are some good distance away. So even if we do climb by the end of this decade to the number 3 position, the number 1 and 2 are still far, far ahead.
Certainly, but if you look at how things have been going, and what was anticipated earlier was that India might reach this particular juncture by 2024. It's happened faster. Why has that happened? And why is India growing at the kind of pace that it is, 7+% every year, and the other economies are slowing down? What do you ascribe the reason for that? There must be multiples.
Well, there are multiple reasons, you're right. I mean, one part of it is, of course, the response to COVID, which, as you will remember, the Indian government took a much more calibrated approach. We maintained macroeconomic stability as being a key consideration when most of these developed countries threw caution to the wind and went for what I would argue is unnecessarily loose monetary and fiscal policy.
Growth on steroids.
It was on steroids, and in my view, wrong, because remember, the COVID crisis and the COVID shock is primarily a supply side shock. And they were dealing with it as if it's a demand shock, which it is not. In a second order sense, it is a demand shock, but its primary impact was a supply side one. And I think they unnecessarily used up all the ammunition on that. Secondly, sticking with the supply side point, not only were we conservative and calibrated in the way we responded on the demand side, and therefore were able to keep resources going for a longer period, we also carried out major structural reforms in our economy. In other words, our supply side is actually better today than it was 2-3 years ago. We liberalized a whole bunch of sectors. We continued to build infrastructure. We privatized a bunch of companies like Air India, LIC, and so on. So, the structural reform part of our policy agenda continued. And so it kept accumulating. And so at the end of that process, we have both macroeconomic stability and an economy that is growing faster than most of these economies.
And the current problems related to inflation and fears of slowdown. In some countries, it's quite apparent that things are slowing down. Is there a difference in the kind of response that say those countries are right now doing, their central banks and others, and what we are doing here at home?
Well, there are some parallels, of course. We are both impacted by a spike in global energy prices. And so to that extent, we need to be conservative in India as well. So we are hiking interest rates as well. even as the world is hiking interest rates. The difference is that, particularly in the case of Europe, they may be having to hike at a time where the economies are quite vulnerable. And so it is a much more complicated problem than, say, hiking in our case, where we will be doing it into a strong recovery. Incidentally, the US is actually in relatively better position than Europe.
Yes.
Latest numbers that we are getting out of the US.
Jobs data is better than what was expected.
So jobs data and other things are in much better shape. So although the US was one of the sources of the excesses, they are actually better off. And here you have to remember, you can get away with a lot of things if you happen to print the world's anchor currency. So in that sense, they are lucky, and they can get away with things that others can't.
Mm-hmm.
But meanwhile, I think Europe has got stuck, and I would add Britain as well in that list, where they are in a very difficult position. Incidentally, many emerging markets are also in a very difficult position, and you've seen in our neighborhood difficult situation in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh. But do remember that this is also showing up in Argentina, in Turkey, where you have 100% inflation now, Egypt, where there are all kinds of problems and they are running out of reserves. So there are all kinds of serious issues that are popping up. Now, this doesn't mean that we are not facing troubles as well. High energy prices is difficult for us as well. So
some say the exchange rate is also a problem, the dollar to rupee parity, which there's a lot of wavering happening.
No, I would actually differ with you on that.
Yeah.
I don't think our exchange rate is a major issue. Our exchange rate is depreciating against the dollar, but appreciating against pretty much everybody else. So in that sense, I agree with the central bank that we should not be defending a level against the dollar. Let the rupee adjust along with the market, and use the foreign exchange reserves to sort of, control volatility. So I agree with that view.
Okay.
So I think there's a difference between the exchange rate and the other problems.
Mm-hmm. And the other is the path that we're choosing to grow as well. I think that is also equally more important, if not more important, in these current times when climate change is a huge challenge and is impacting every corner of the globe. No matter where you look, something or the other extreme weather events are taking place, and the path that India has chosen, how vital is that to ensure that we grow in the manner that is sustainable, that is, for our generations to come?
So this is, of course, an important issue, and in this context, let me also point out that while we are suffering right now from oil price spike, which is a reminder the fact that India has not been blessed with a large amount of hydrocarbons. We have some coal, but generally speaking, we are not blessed with hydrocarbons. So simply by perforce, we have to think about other sources. The good news is India is blessed with a lot of sunshine, and it gets a lot of sunshine precisely when we need it most, which is at the spike of summer. So I think this is something that we can take advantage of up to a point. So in that sense, moving on to particularly solar-based energy production is something that suits our circumstances. But I will argue here also that there are problems with renewables that we need to take into account. And for this reason, we do need to keep investing in other sources as well as a backup. And I will argue here that some thermal capacity does need to be looked after and built, and I would argue some other sources, like for example nuclear, also need to be thought of. So
there's hydrogen and biofuels as well, because now there's a lot of emphasis, the PM has laid a lot of emphasis on biogas too, and there's tremendous potential there.
So we can build see, biogas has an advantage of being localized, and there is and it's cheap and so on, but it's difficult to load the grid with biogas as a source of energy. So I think while that is a good addition, especially at the local level, we have to have other serious backups. For example, nuclear and some amount of thermal too.
Okay. And in terms of how things are going to go for our other developmental needs, because again, people talk about what, the agenda that is left undone, eliminating poverty and bringing up India on the Human Development Index. All that, how would we proceed on that, ensuring that, there is not increasing inequity, but the equity part gets the emphasis?
So first of all, there is a lot of talk about jobs and jobless growth and so on. I'm not of the camp that jobless growth is really the issue. The point is, if we sustain growth, jobs come back. And the latest PLFS data shows that as growth recovered, unemployment rate came down very sharply. So my view is sustaining high levels of growth is absolutely critical. So that's the first and most important thing. Do not get caught up in all kinds of bogus arguments about jobless growth. Keep growth going. So that's sort of step number one. Secondly, you've got to spread this growth, and that requires, in particular, creating hard infrastructure in the hinterland of the country, also in the major cities, but in the hinterlands as well. So you have seen in recent times a lot of emphasis on building out infrastructure into the northeast, building up hard infrastructure in places like UP and so on, which have historically had poor quality infrastructure. So this is an important part, that keep growth going and create the infrastructure for it to spread into the hinterland. So this is the number two. Number three, as far as equity is concerned, our approach has always been to directly target absolute poverty. So this is derived from the idea of Antodaya, as you know.
Yeah.
And so this is a very different from sort of the Western idea of inequality. Our idea is much more driven by absolute poverty and interventions to deal with absolute poverty. And so therefore, you would have seen direct efforts, whether it's the food program, or it is Ujjwala scheme, or it is the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana. These are all based on direct interventions, and not this idea of sort of some fuzzy indirect effort through taxation or through UBI, which is popular with some economists. I'm not a big fan of that approach.
Okay. And last of all, of course, this cannot happen, and it's not happened really without the kind of digital transformation that India has seen. So perhaps more on that front as well. I think the PM's Economic Advisory Council had a paper on patents as well, which again speaks of how we need to further encourage innovation and entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. So our entire economic approach is based on entrepreneurship, risk-taking, and innovation. But in order to have a risk-taking innovation culture, you need to have a good patents ecosystem. That is absolutely critical. Ironically, the patent system is actually a cash positive activity for the government. In other words, if you get more patents, the government actually makes more money.
Correct.
So that is why I don't see any reason why we shouldn't dramatically expand our patenting system. I mean, we have currently 850 patent officers. This includes examiners, controllers, admin, everything. Now compare that with 13,500 people in China, or 8,500 in the US. I mean, I can easily see, a doubling or tripling of our patenting capacity is a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. We should just go ahead and just expand it. There's a huge amount of backlog, which is totally unnecessary. And so I have been advocating quite strongly, as you know, for a dramatic expansion in our patenting ecosystem.
Certainly, and I hope that happens, and we press on ahead. It's about, of course, growth and overtaking other countries and being there, in the number 1, 2, 3 spots as well down the line. But of course, a lot of things to be done in that process, in getting there and getting it right as well for everyone in our country. Ours is the second largest population in the world. Pretty soon it will be the largest population in the world, and that is one thing that perhaps has to be borne in mind topmost while we pursue high rate growth. Thank you so much for joining us, Sanjeev Sane.